Alright, so in this video, we're going to go ahead and create a shader for a realistic ice material. Now, when you're creating a ice material, you should know that ice can be both a simple and complex shader to create at the same time. And in order to understand this, you need to understand how ice actually looks like and how it is driven. So to do that, what we're going to take a look is one simple image where we can see a bunch of different ice cubes. Now, the thing that we can notice, especially on this model, is that the surface of these cubes is not perfect, but it is rather very rough. You can see cracks, you can see chips on the edges. So all around the surface is not a smooth surface. Now, this is very important thing to understand is because when you're creating a shader for ice, the micro details in the model will play a pivotal role in how your ice shader is going to end up looking. But we'll see how this thing looks as we go forward. So for now, I'm going to move this thing to the side and let's start slowly building up our material so we can see how this thing plays in. I'm going to start by starting the IPR render so we can see what is happening here. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change the diffuse to black. There we go. And for now, I'm not going to play around with the reflection because I want to slowly start building up this entire shader. So we know that the refractive index for this thing should be very refractive. So we can either go full on refractive or just lower this thing a bit more like this. But for now, I'm actually going to go full on. And I want to change the IOR. So for this is 1.31, I think. For ice, and I'm going to change the IOR for the reflection as well to 1.31. There we go. So once we have it like this, we can notice that our shader is looking really weird because we can't see much of it. And now what we need to do is we need to start adding in some maps to help us with the surface over here. Now, like I said previously, as we could see over here, the surface of these cubes is very irregular. So if we want to have something happening in here, what we would need to do is we would need to add in some irregularity because this model is a pretty perfect round sphere. So the way that we can add in those irregularities can be in one of three ways. The first way would be the easiest way, and that would be to take a model, bring it into a sculpting software like ZBrush or Mudbox or even Blender, and do all the little details, the cracks and the crevices, and then export a very high density mesh, and then apply our material right on it. The second way would be to use a bump map, and in our case we can use that, but the thing is with the bump map we can add in small details, maybe like these folds or some of these smaller details over here. But as far as these larger cracks in the ice, we will need to resort to using Vray displacement maps. And using a Vray displacement map can be both a positive and a negative, because this can be as a double-edged sword, because it will really amp up the rendering time. So let's go ahead and first of all add in a bump map just to help us with the surface of this image or this model. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Vray bitmap. Go ahead and locate the map. And I'm going to choose one of the maps that we have in our textures seamless folder. So I'm going to take this one, corrugated metal light, click on open, and that's going to add in the this map in our bump map. Now what I want to do is I want to decrease how much of this bump map is going to be seen. So let's try with a low value of something like maybe 5. Let's just take a smaller sample here so we can see the results a bit faster. All right, not bad. And the interesting thing that you can see here is right away that with this normal map, we are getting a breakup in the surface, and it's starting to get a bit of a reflection happening here. And if we check up our reflection or our reflect, we're going to see it's black. So if we go into the pass and check the reflection, we're going to see that we don't really have any reflection happening in the shader. So everything that's happening at the moment is happening in the refraction pass of our shader. So we haven't done anything to the reflective pass. I'm going to go ahead and lower this even more because I want this thing to be very, very subtle, like this. There we go. So this just adds in that bit of surface imperfection that we can start to build on this. Now, the next thing I want to add here is going to be, I want to have reflection because ice is reflective. So I'm going to increase the reflection, same time. And this is just going to give us an extra layer of believability or realism. So now if we go over back to the reflection pass, we're going to start to see something happening here in the reflection. All right. And now, once we have this, the next step would be to add in the element that actually makes glass behave as glass. And that is by using a roughness map in our glossiness for the refraction. And the way that I'm going to do this is, so in the glossiness slot, what I'm going to do is I want to add in a composite map. The reason why I'm using a composite is because I want to have a couple of different layers that are going to get mixed into this. So the first thing that I'm going to do is here I'm going to put a noise map. And now I'm going to go inside the noise. And just so I can see this thing better, I'm going to click on Isolate Selected. And this is going to show me how this map looks like. All right, so as I can see at the moment, is a bit too large. So we need to decrease the size. Let's try it with something like 5. Change it to fractal. All right, increase the levels to maybe like 6. 8. This is going to give me more details in here, which is something that I want. Let's try with something smaller then. 3. All right. So like this, if we go and turn off the isolate right now and just put it like this. Now what we can see is that the reflection glossiness will be driven by this noise map. So that's going to give us a nice breakup into the surface glossiness and a nice way to add in some imperfection, which is kind of interesting because that is how ice really is starting to shape up. Because if we take a look at this image over here, we're going to notice that depending on whether or not this surface is smooth or is rough, the reflection is going to be more or less perfect, or is going to be a bit more diffused or glossy. So by adding in this noise, it's going to break up that reflection glossiness. Now what I can do here is also add in another layer, and in here just add in another noise map. In this case, I can choose a different size. Let's just check it up again. So here we had a size of 3. So here let's try a size of 1, or maybe larger, like 7. Yeah, this should work. And what I can do here is, in this case, instead of using a normal map here, or a normal blending mode, I can put it to darken, which is going to make this thing a bit more pronounced, or even go to some of the other different blending modes and see how that thing looks. So multiply. Okay, I think multiply is going to look better because we're going to get some difference in color. And once we leave both of these mixing up like this, I can change the opacity to maybe like 50 here. And that's going to give us an interesting result for this thing to render like this. So if I let this thing render, we're slowly going to start seeing the underlying surface coming to life and looking more and more like what we're seeing in this case. So now, before I actually continue on and pack in another layer of details, what I want to do is I want to use extra pass that's going to help me get in some of these crevices like I said previously. So for that, what we're going to do is we're going to use a Vray Displacement Modifier. Adding that is not really that hard or complicated. You just select where you want to have the modifier or the displacement happening, and you go over in your modifier list, and from here just use a Vray Displacement Mod. Now, a word of advice again is when you're using Vray Displacement, take into account the fact that this will really increase your render times. So be very, very careful when you're using displacement mods. So for this to start working, what we need to do is we need to use a certain map that we want to displace. So I'm going to click over here and choose a Vray bitmap. I'm going to take this Vray bitmap, put it in here, and use it as an instance. All right. So now let's choose a map. I'm going to use one of my textures. Click over here. And from our seamless folder, in our textures folder, we're going to use the grunge 01 and click OK. All right, now before I do anything else, let's just see how this thing looks like. So I'm going to restart the IPR and make sure to just isolate this thing. All right, you can actually see how this thing looks. Now, for the amount in here, all right, there we go. The amount is going to control how far this displacement is going to go through. At the moment, I have it here on 0.2 centimeters. By default, I think it's at 1 centimeter. So if you put it at 1, what tends to happen is that's going to really emphasize this, and it's going to really protrude this around. Now, in my case, I don't really need it to go that far out, but I'm going to dial it down to like what's to 0.2. And this should help us get all those smaller details in our model. Now, I want to say this thing for the third time. This will add in extra rendering time. So be very mindful when you're adding displacement for materials that have a lot of refraction happening in them. So at the moment, if we just render what we have like this, I can show you how the final look is going to be on this material. And it's going to look more or less like what you're seeing in here. So what is very visible is that all those details that are coming up from the bump map can be seen as these small imperfections, while the details that are coming in from the displacement can be seen as very, very subtle cracks around the surface. Now, this thing, even though it's a relatively small render, it's 1000 by 1200 resolution, took almost 2 hours to finish. So as you can see, as I noted a couple of times already, if you're going to use displacement with this, that's going to be a bit of a problem on your final rendering times. All right, so now let's move on to another aspect of creating an ice shader. And that is what happens with ice when it stays out for a while and it starts changing the actual look and properties of the ice. Namely, it starts to fog up, as we can see over here. And how do we add in that fog into our nice looking ice? Before I actually go and deal with the fog, what I'm going to do is, for now, I'm just going to turn off the Vray displacement mod. So it just is going to be faster and more responsive while we're building the shader. So let's choose just one piece over here. Restart our interactive rendering. There we go. So I can see what is happening. And now we're going to go back to our Vray material. And if you're using the latest version of Vray, what you're going to have as an option over here is under the translucency, you have a way of choosing what kind of a subsurface scattering we're going to have, or what kind of a type of a translucency we're going to have. Here we have volumetric and we have subsurface scattering. Now in this case, what we want to do is we want to add in the volumetric translucency. So by just clicking over here, right away we're going to get a different look. But what we need to do in here now is we need to change the parameters for this volumetric fog. The first thing I'm going to do is, if I go over and just mouse over the fog color node, I can actually get a brief explanation as to what it does. So what it says is that the fog color is used to basically simulate thickness of the fog for transparent and thin objects. So the interesting thing with this is that if you start adding in color in here, what it's going to do is going to actually detract that or subtract that color from the fog. So in this case, I want to leave it on grayscale, but I'm going to increase this thing a bit like this. And this is going to give us that look of a fogginess inside. Now, we can choose what color we want the fog inside to be. So what I'm going to do is change the scattering color to something a bit more bluish. But be very careful, because when you're adding in this color, so if you go over and really saturate this thing with color, you can see that it really, really reeks in. So what we're trying to do is be very mindful of this when we're adding it. So maybe something like this, very subtle. There we go. And the next thing I want to do is I just want to increase the depth on how much the subsurface scattering is going to happen. So if I go with 5, then everything up to 5 centimeters in depth, we will get that volumetric look. Now, there is another thing that I need to note here, is that there isn't really a one click solution or one value solution for everything, because this is very dependent on the size of your model. So you're gonna have to go in and do a bit of testing and prodding until you get the right values for your model, depending on what you're trying to recreate. So for now, I'm going to leave it to about 5 centimeters. And we have the scatter color, it's something like whiter, And what I'm going to do is I'm going to restart or re-enable the Vray displacement mods and just restart it like this. Okay, so with this setup where we have the reflection setup, we have the refraction, we have the glossiness for the refraction, we have a bump map and a displacement map, everything set up. If we start this thing as a render, what we're going to end up with is a shader that looks pretty realistic. So I can again show you how this thing looks at the final version. For that, I'm just going to put this thing over here. And right next to it, I'm going to put the previous version that we rendered. And you can see the difference between both of these. So on the left side, we have the previous one without the actual fog. And on the right side, we have the version with the fog applied to it. So as you can see, both of them are the same material. But because we have the fog, now this is starting to look a lot more like the ice that we were trying to recreate coming from these ice cubes right here. So you can see the fog up happening in here. Now, another problem that you're going to run into if you're going to use the second approach is that adding in fog on already transparent or refractive material that's glossy, that's going to add in even more rendering time. So this thing actually ended up rendering for over 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours. And needless to say, it does look much nicer, but you have to pay the rendering time for it. Another thing that is very important to note is that when you're going to use something like this, because we have a thickness for this, if you take a look at the top side over here, it actually does look a bit different from what you're seeing over here. And since the geometry is overlapping over here, where it's a bit thicker, you can see all of that wider ice gathering up in there and giving us this look of what you would expect to get from ice. So that should more or less cover the creative process on how to create a ice shader. And depending on whether you're looking for a clean ice, you can just follow along and do the route for what we got here on the left. And you can also now create a fogged up ice by just following along with what we did in the second portion of this lesson. So again, depending on what sort of an ice you would like to get, just follow the steps that we did, and you can get a very realistic looking ice material for your renderings.